Planet of the Apes saga has spanned 55 years and 9 movies, with a 10th just on the horizon, and to give you all my thoughts on every single one of them, we're going to tier them all. If you like what I do here and want to show your support, be sure to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so that you can stay up to date on all things Apes. Enjoy the video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ape Nation, your #1 source for all things Planet of the Apes on YouTube. My name is Josh, and today we are doing something a little bit different, a little bit more relaxed, and something that I think is going to be a lot of fun, a Planet of the Apes tier list. The reason I wanted to do this as opposed to a ranking video is because I thought it would be a great way to just give you all my general thoughts on each movie from the jump. I'm going to be doing an in-depth review for every single movie leading up to Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes next year. I haven't decided when I'm going to be starting that, but it's going to be pretty soon. It's going to be, if not the end of this year, it'll be very early in January. But until then, I wanted to start with this. I'm not going to go too in-depth with my thoughts on every single movie. I'm just going to give you my general 2 or 3 minute blurb on how I feel about each movie, what I like about it, what I don't like about it, etc., etc. So I don't want to beat around the bush too much. I just want to dive right in and get started. So I'm just going to kick things off and start with the original 1968 Planet of the Apes starring Charlton Heston. I'm not even going to make you wait to find out which tier this one's going in. It's S. Planet of the Apes from 1968. It's one of my favorite movies pretty much ever made. This is in my top 10 of all time. This is one of my favorite science fiction films of all time. I think it's a really, really incredible film. Just some highlights for me. Charlton Heston, I think, is a great lead. Some of the acting choices are a little dated, but that was just the style back then. I think he's a great lead. Roddy McDowall, Kim Hunter, Maurice Evans, I think, are all fantastic in the movie as Cornelius, Zira, and Dr. Zaius. Jerry Goldsmith's music, I think, is one of the best scores of all time. You're going to hear me mention scores a lot in this video. I'm a huge musical score person. I love listening to scores. I love a lot of composers, so you're going to hear me talk about that. And Jerry Goldsmith is an icon. He's one of the all-time great composers, and I love his music in this movie. Something I really also love about this movie is the themes that it touches on. It talks about things like racism, classism, animal cruelty, and animal testing. It has anti-war themes. It talks about the danger of religion in government. It goes into all these things, and it does it with so much, I don't know if I would say subtlety, because it's pretty blatant when you watch the movie, but it integrates these concepts and talks about these things in ways that are well integrated into the plot, well integrated within the characters and the dialogue, and it all ties that together so well within all the world building and the science fiction of it all. Just the overall visual aesthetic I love about this movie. I love the way it looks. I love the way it makes you feel. It has that weird dystopian look, but it also looks very primitive. I love that blend between the two. And of course, I can't talk about this movie without talking about the makeup work. It is some of the most iconic to have ever come out of Hollywood, and I think it's still to this day really, really holds up well. Obviously, it's dated in some aspects just because of how things have evolved since then, but still, I think the ape makeup in this movie holds up incredibly well. I love the design, I love the look, and also the costumes and the production design is just all so incredible. It just all looks amazing. This movie, for when it came out, for when it was made, it's revolutionary for how much they were able to pull off and how incredible everything was able to look and what they were able to do. I really love the characters. Taylor, I think, is a great lead. I really love Zira and Cornelius. They were my favorite. When I first saw this movie, I immediately latched onto them. I loved them. They were just such immediately lovable characters. And then I think Dr. Zaius is a really, really great villain. He's not my favorite villain in the franchise overall, but I think he's a fantastic villain. He's definitely up there as one of the best in the entire series. He's one of the all-time classic movie villains, and I think he's really, really great. The story is really great. The premise just in general is really fun, and it's really interesting. It has that classic fish out of water exploration concept, all the great world building that happens within it, all the great character development that happens throughout it with everybody, and Taylor slowly peeling back all those layers throughout the movie until you get to that iconic twist ending, which is one of the best endings of any movie ever. Overall, it's just an incredible movie. I have no flaws. For me, there is not a single flaw with this movie, outside of a couple of dated aspects, but that's just something that comes with a movie that's this old. It's an incredibly important movie for the science fiction genre. It's incredibly important just for film in general and film history. It's one of the greatest films of all time. It's one of the most iconic films of all time, and I love it. it, and that is why it goes in S tier. Moving on to the next movie in the series, we have Beneath the Planet of the Apes. This is a very difficult movie for me to place because I feel differently about it depending on the day and depending on when I watch it. Overall, I think this is an okay movie. I do have things I like about it, but I also have a handful of things I don't like about it. I'm going to start with what I do like about it, because overall I think I like slightly more than I don't like, but what I don't like really does bother me a lot, so I go back and forth. But James Franciscus as the new lead, kind of the new Taylor, so to speak, he's okay. I think he's charismatic enough as a lead. James Gregory, I think, does a great job as Ursus, the villain. I do like that this movie goes heavy on the anti-war and religion stuff. Not talking about, my personal feelings, just the way that the movie explores that stuff, I think is really interesting, and I think it utilizes it well within its story. I also really like the mutants. I didn't like the mutants when I was a kid, when I first saw this movie, but as I've gotten older, I started to really like and appreciate them. I think they're really cool. And my only issue with them is that we don't really get enough time spent building up to them. I also really like the villain. I think Ursus is a pretty underrated villain. I don't think he's great, but I think he's fun, and I think he's kind of entertaining. I think he does add a bit to the movie overall. And I also really, really like the ending. I think the ending is ballsy, and I think it's crazy. Obviously, the only reason the ending is the way it is because Charlton Heston wanted the franchise to end because he didn't want any more sequels and he didn't want to come back to do another one. That's why he's barely in this movie. So obviously the circumstances surrounding the ending are kind of stupid and are really the ideal situation for making a movie. But it works because it creates an ending that I think is really awesome. Not one of the best endings of the series, but it's a ballsy one, and it's one that I really appreciate. As for what I don't like about the movie, the thing with this movie is it's kind of a tale of two halves. You have the first half of this movie, which is just a very rushed rehash of everything we got in the original movie. It just takes this new character, does the exact same thing that we saw in the last movie just so we can get caught up to speed, and then we go in a different direction for the second half with all the mutants and the underground stuff. Conceptually, I actually really like that kind of structure for a sequel. I actually think you can do some really cool things. Reintroduce the audience to a new character with a familiar setting, but then you take them on a new path. And I think that's a great idea. The problem is they just rush through everything. So we don't really get enough time to really care about Brent, which is why I think he's a pretty mediocre lead, which is one of my other issues with the movie. He's not compelling. He's not an interesting character. Like I said, James Franciscus does a good enough job in the role, so it makes him kind of entertaining to watch. But other than that, I don't think he's that interesting of a character. I don't really care about him. When it comes to the second half of the movie, it's more interesting than the first half, but it's still very rushed. And that's a lot of my issue with this movie. It's a very rushed story. They want to do a lot, but they don't really take enough time to do it. And they do it with a character that I don't find particularly interesting. And it really bums me out because you have something that could have been great and could have been really exciting and interesting, and obviously not as good as the original, but something that can hold up to the original. And I just don't think they did that with this movie. And there is one other issue I have with the movie, and it's more of a budgetary thing as far as I know, but there's a couple shots throughout the movie where in the background you can see that's very obvious that they didn't use ape makeup for the background apes this time, and they just put on pullover masks. It's very obvious because it looks really, really bad. I don't completely fault them for it just because I think it was a budget thing. They had to keep the makeup budget down to continue making these movies, but it shows and it doesn't look good. So overall, the more I think about it, I don't dislike this movie. It has things I like in it. It has things I don't like in it. I enjoy watching it to a point, but if I'm being honest with myself, I'm probably going to go and put this one in C tier. I don't think it's necessarily a very good movie, but I think it's an okay-ish movie with a lot of flaws and then also a lot of things I do enjoy. So that's why I'm going to put it in C. So next up, we're going to the third movie in the franchise, which is Escape from the Planet of the Apes. I think this might be a controversial take because I've seen some fans that really don't like this one. I don't really know what the general consensus is for some of these. For me, Escape from the Planet of the Apes is one of my favorites in the entire series. I love this movie. I think this is a fantastic sequel. I think this takes all of the ideas and concepts that were presented in the first and second films and takes the challenge that they were left off with the ending of the second movie and does something really, really unique and does something really innovative and makes it fun and interesting. Kim Hunter is outstanding in this movie. I think her performance completely steals the show as Zira in this movie. I already loved her as a character, but I love her even more after this one. She is amazing. Her along with, obviously, Roddy McDowall as Cornelius. I think the two of them make for great really, really compelling leads. And I really like that this movie explores them more as characters and as people, and you really get to know and empathize and care about them. And it's an awesome exploration of both of their characters. And then the other standout actor for me is Eric Braeden as the villain, Dr. Hasslein, who is one of my favorite villains in this entire series. I think Hasslein is actually, to be honest, he's one of my favorite movie villains in general. I'm going to talk a lot more about this when I get to my Escape from the Planet of the Apes review, but this is a character that I think is a dictionary definition of what a great movie villain is. Someone who you understand why they are the way they are, even the fact that what they're doing is terrible, what they're doing is cruel. You understand why they're doing it, and you understand where they're coming from. You understand his perspective so much. And he's really not an evil person when you really stop and look at what he's doing, why he's doing it. I mean, when you get to the end of the movie, it becomes a bit more unhinged, but he's not an evil, cruel person. He's someone who just wants to keep the human race alive and is terrified, and he's acting out of fear, but he's also acting out of logic. And that's why I think he's just a great villain. That's one of the biggest reasons I love this movie so much. It just has a great villain and great lead characters. And I also love the music in this movie. I think this is some of the better music in the entire series outside of the original film. I think the tone is really unique. I love that it's this weird blend of fish out of water comedy, but also really dark drama. I love that it's basically an inverse of the original film. I think that's really clever. I also really like the supporting characters, Lewis and Stevie. I love what they bring to the table here. I love their dynamic with Cornelius and Zira. I think they have a great relationship, and I love seeing it explored throughout the movie. And also, it's a really funny movie, and I know that maybe some people don't like that, but I love that it's a really funny movie. Just the way that it plays with the apes coming into this society, rather than the approach of the original, which was more, what's going on? This is so terrifying. This is more of a, oh, they're here. Let's show them what the human world is like. And it's really funny, and it's really entertaining, and it's really sweet. There's a couple things I don't really like. There's small issues, but they do bother me sometimes when I watch the movie. There's a big tonal shift about 2/3 of the way through the movie. Like I said, it balances this fish out of water comedy tone, and it's light, and it's funny, and it's jovial, and it's really fun, but then it's also gets really dark and really serious and really sad and somber at the end in the last 20-30 minutes. It doesn't really get to that point gradually. There's a bit of like a couple moments throughout the first 2/3 of the movie where you kind of hint towards that, and then it just spirals within the course of like 2 minutes to, oh wow, this is really dark and really intense, and it just keeps that momentum for the rest of the movie. It doesn't bother me. It's just a little jarring when it happens. And then I also think some of the humor is a little corny. I think most of it works and most of it's really funny, but some of it is a little, not really my taste, a little too early 1970s. But for the most part, I love this movie. I think it's fantastic. So good, so well-rounded, such compelling characters, such a great story, such a clever direction to take this franchise in after the first 2 films, and I love it to death. For me, it's not quite as good as the original. It has some issues, and it's overall just not as iconic. It's not as well done, but it comes very close. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in A tier. It's one of my favorites of the series. Next up, we have the 4th film in the original Planet of the Apes series, and this is Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. I really like this movie a lot. I loved it when I was younger. When I first watched these movies, this was my favorite of the entire series. I thought this was the best one. It was the darkest. It was the most intense. I saw these movies when I was a teenager for the first time. So obviously those kind of movies are what you really gravitate towards when you're like 14, 15 years old. And so I just loved how intense and dark this movie was. I don't quite love it as much as I did back then. I think there's a couple more flaws that I didn't really notice when I was younger that I've kind of taken away from it for me as I've watched it as years have gone on, as I've gotten a little bit older, and appreciated Escape more, and this one a slightly bit less. I still think this is a really, really good movie. I like it a lot. Roddy McDowall is fantastic as Caesar. I think he really is great. Everyone talks about how incredible Andy Serkis is as Caesar, and we'll get to him, don't worry. But I don't think we talk enough about how great the original Caesar character was. I think he is a fantastic lead in this movie, and I think Roddy McDowall does a great job portraying him. I also really like Ricardo Montalban in this movie. He's really fun. He's really compelling. It's just sad that he only gets a little bit of screen time. He's only in the movie for like the first half. And then you also have Harry Rhodes as McDonald, and I really like him as a character. I think this performance is kind of underrated in the series. I really love him in this role, and I love his relationship with Caesar as we see the movie progress. That relationship is really strong and one of the core foundations of what makes this movie work so well. I also think, and this will kind of tie into one of my flaws with the movie later, but Don Murray as Governor Breck, I think, does an excellent job. He is crazy, he is unhinged, and he is so over the top, but I think he does a great job with that. So I really, really like what he brings to the table here. And again, I keep talking about the themes that these movies touch on. What I love about this movie is that it goes heavy on the racism and allegories about slavery. It is not holding back. It is not subtle at all. It is completely in your face. And I think for the time this movie came out, it was very important to be in your face with stuff like that. And I love that it touches on that kind of stuff, and it ties it into this really awesome story about revolution. And it's dark, and it's a violent movie. It's very, very violent. It's the most violent of the entire series up to this point. Actually, up until probably Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. That was one of the things that I loved about it so much when I was younger, and I still like that about it now. I also think it's a really tight, really well-paced movie. This movie is like an hour and 26 minutes, and it just flies by. Like, there is no fat. It's compelling, it's intense, it's dark, and it stays that way the entire time, and it's just a snowball effect. And so it really works well in terms of the directing, in terms of the pacing. As far as what I don't like about this movie, and like I was talking about earlier with Governor Breck, I think Don Murray does a great job in the role, but I just find the villain character himself to be a little one note. He's just, I'm a bad guy because I'm a bad guy, and that's why I exist in this movie. But the reason I don't think he's necessarily a terrible villain is because I think Don Murray does such a good job at elevating that character to being entertaining and fun to watch. He's such a good foil for Caesar, so I forgive it a little bit, but it is something that I do think about every time I watch this movie. The other thing, and this is kind of the main issue I have with the movie, is that the time jump just doesn't really make sense. This movie takes place 18 years after Escape from the Planet of the Apes, and in that time, humanity went from 1973 to this weird dystopian slavery hellscape, and it's crazy how fast that happened. And obviously, maybe there's, an argument to be made that that's kind of the point, is just show how fast something like that can happen. But for me, it just felt a little too fast how we got there, and all the dogs and cats were just wiped out by this plague. Things like that, it's a little rushed for me. And maybe it's just because I now have the Caesar trilogy with Andy Serkis, and so that happens much more gradually. But for me, it's just crazy how fast something like that happened. It doesn't completely make sense, but it doesn't completely knock the movie down for me. And then one other thing, I think some of the visual effects are a little dated, and obviously I can forgive it to a point, but when it comes to all of the blood and all of the more the action heavy sequences, some of the visual effects don't completely hold up. Some of them do, but some of them don't. Those are my only issues with the movie. Overall, I do think it's a really good movie. I like it a lot. I still appreciate it. Every time I watch it, I have a really great time with it. It's another really solid movie in this franchise. Not quite as good as Escape for me, but it's still a really good movie, so I'm going to put it in B tier. Next up, we have the fifth and final film in the original Planet of the Apes saga, which is Battle for the Planet of the Apes. This is the one movie in the franchise that I really just do not care for almost at all. There are a couple things I do like about this movie. I think Roddy McDowall was great. He's still Roddy McDowall. He's still awesome. The makeup work obviously is still good for him and for all the other apes. I think Virgil is a really fun character. I think he's a fun companion to Caesar. I think they have a nice little dynamic between the two of them. And there's some entertaining battle scenes towards the end. I think they're fun to watch. And I really like the ending. I think the ending, like not the ending of the story, but like the final scene with the Caesar statue crying in the future, really, really powerful ending for this series. That was a great note to end this entire saga off on. But unfortunately, that's kind of where my positives with this movie end. The movie just looks really cheap. I don't know if there was just a continuing decline in box office, so they kept lowering the budgets, but it just looks very cheap overall throughout this entire film. The overall aesthetic, the cinematography just does not look great. Aldo is a terrible villain. I'm sorry, I find him to be a really comical, boring, one-note, dull, lifeless villain who is just a mustache twirling, I'm a bad guy because I'm a bad guy, and there's nothing entertaining or compelling about him. He's just there. And then you have Caesar's son and that whole relationship, which I don't think is terrible, but ultimately I just don't really care about his son Cornelius. I think he's fine. I think the relationship between Caesar and his wife is a little more compelling than that. I don't find the father-son relationship to be that well done, to be completely honest with you. I think it's just put into the movie. It's not really given enough time to develop and breathe. This is one of my biggest issues with the whole movie. The time jump in Conquest didn't make sense, but I can forgive it because I think the rest of the movie is so good. The time jump in this movie makes zero sense. You go from the ending of Conquest, which was only 10 years prior to this, where suddenly Earth has just become this post-apocalyptic war zone, and apes can now speak fluent English, and they have already basically become the dominant species on the planet. and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It feels like 100+ years have passed in 10. It really doesn't work, and it's confusing. It makes no sense, and it really takes me out of the movie when I watch it. I'm not one of these people that is constantly looking for plot holes and what makes sense and things, but when it's so blatant and it's such a major part of the film, and also when there's so many other issues in the movie, it really sticks out, and it really takes it down even more for me. And then also, the other thing I don't like, the bomb shelter humans, they're not really that interesting. They're kind of just annoying to me. So yeah, I have a lot of issues with this movie, obviously. I don't really think it's good. I don't know if I'd call it a terrible movie, because there are things I do enjoy in it. I can't quite put it in F, because I think there's enough here to elevate it above that. But for me, Battle for the Planet of the Apes is going to go in D tier. It's not a horrible movie. It's not the worst movie ever made, but it's easily the weakest of the original series, and I don't particularly care for it almost at all. Next up, we are finally out of the original Planet of the Apes series and on to the remake from 2001, directed by Tim Burton, starring Mark Wahlberg. This is a movie that I'm very conflicted on, because on the one hand, there are things I do like about it. I do think it's a little bit overhated. I think people shit talk this movie way too much. It's got enough that it doesn't deserve all the bashing and hate that it gets. But on the other hand, there are things about it that do deserve some bashing and some hate. For starters, again, I'll talk about what I like. I think Tim Roth is the standout as far as acting is concerned. I think he is so good in this movie. I love his performance. I also think General Thade, played by him, is a really fun and entertaining villain, mainly because of Roth's performance, but I generally think he's a solid, interesting, and well-done villain for what the story is in this movie. I also think Michael Clarke Duncan and Helena Bonham Carter and Paul Giamatti all are really good in their roles. The characters, not really big on, but I think the performances make up for that. I think they're entertaining and do what they can with what they have to work with. And then obviously the makeup work is incredible in this movie. It is astounding what they were able to do in this movie, I think, especially for General Thade, when it still holds up really well. And then the production design, I think it's really incredible, and that's something you will never not be able to say about a Tim Burton movie. I'm personally a big Tim Burton fan. I love a lot of his movies, Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, Sleepy Hollow. I'm personally a big Batman Returns fan. I love a lot of Tim Burton's older films. I actually really loved his latest show, Wednesday. I love Tim Burton. I think he's great, and when he's making Tim Burton tailored projects, I think he does great. But when he's taking other people's properties for the most part and makes them Tim Burtonized, don't really think it works well. And this is very much a exact example of that, because I'm going to talk about what I don't like. On top of the fact, the way Tim Burton took this franchise and made it his own, I appreciate that for him, but it doesn't really work for me. And I also think Mark Wahlberg is horribly miscast. I like Mark Wahlberg. I actually think he's a good actor, and I've seen a couple performances of him where he's fantastic. I think he's incredible in Deepwater Horizon. I think he's obviously great in Boogie Nights and The Departed. He can be a really great actor, but in this, he's just kind of bland, and he's not interesting, and he's not very good. He's not compelling at all. I also just think all the human characters are really bland. To be honest, I don't think most of the characters in general, but the human characters especially are just not interesting, not really memorable whatsoever. The ending makes no sense, and it's really bad. Obviously, I'm not the first person to say that, but it doesn't make any sense. It just kind of happens and comes out of nowhere, and you're left wondering what happened here. Why is this the way it is? And then it just cuts to credits, and that's it. Also, the story is just the original premise of the first movie, but way more convoluted than it needs to be, and way less interesting than it was in the original. It's not horribly done, but it's just not very good, and it just makes you go, I'd rather watch the original movie. And the tone of this thing is all over the place. I can't tell if it wants to be very comedic. I can't tell if it wants to be really dark. I can't tell if it wants to be this science fiction epic or if it wants to be a drama. It's trying to be all these things, and it doesn't balance it well at all. It doesn't really know how to commit to any of them. It's such a mixed bag of a movie. I don't particularly care for it, but I also think it's nowhere near as bad as people make it out to be. For me, I'm probably going to put it right next to Battle for the Planet of the Apes in D tier. I really wish it was better, but it's not, unfortunately. All right, finally we get to the new trilogy, the Caesar trilogy, as I call it. Let's just kick this thing off. Andy Serkis Oh my god, he is phenomenal in this movie. And he is the reason that people raved about this when it first came out. On top of that, the groundbreaking CGI in this movie. This is the first Apes film that did not utilize makeup and went for CGI. And I know some people hate that, and I know that's sacrilege to some people, but CGI can be just as great, if not better, than makeup, than practical effects sometimes. And what they were able to do with this movie visually is nothing short of incredible. It's stunning from start to finish what they were able to do. And like I said, Andy Serkis, his performance in this as Caesar is phenomenal. I also really like John Lithgow and James Franco. I think they do a solid job in their roles. And what I really love about this movie a lot, and I think this is actually my favorite part of the movie, is that they're telling an origin story, but to get to the root of it, it's a story about revolution. You know, it's not just the origin of a character, but it's the start of an uprising. It's the revolution of an entire species. I also really love the music in this movie. Patrick Doyle's music. Patrick Doyle's a composer that I really like a lot, and I think the score in this movie is really underappreciated. I think it's fantastic. Not as good as, you know, Jerry Goldsmith's from the original, and it's not as good as the Michael Giacchino's music from the two following movies, but I love his music in this movie. I also really love Caesar's arc. It's incredibly powerful. It's really, really compelling, and it works really well. Also, I'll say this movie might have my favorite scene from any Planet of the Apes movie ever, and that is the moment where Caesar says no. This is a movie scene for the ages. This, to me, is like one of the most iconic film scenes of the 21st century, at least as far as blockbusters go. I love this scene. It's so well done, and the build-up to it is just perfect. I think the relationship between Caesar and Will is really moving, and that's the backbone of what launches us into Caesar's story and what tells his overall journey and where he comes from. And yeah, it's a really, really fantastic movie. I do have a couple issues with it. They're not big issues, but there's a couple of things that do bug me as the years have gone on. First one being some of the visual effect shots, a little bit dated. Some of the CGI doesn't quite hold up as well as it did in 2011. Most of it still looks fantastic, but some of it doesn't quite hold up. I also think the human characters, for the most part, get like bare minimum character development. I think Will is good. I don't think he's great. I think his father, again, is good. I don't think he's great. I think Caroline, played by Frida Pinto, is okay. She's fine, but they're all just kind of borderline likable. They're not really interesting or compelling, but they serve their purpose, so that doesn't bother me too much, but it is something I wish we got a little more of. And because we do get more of that in the two later movies, I do wish we got more of it here. And then the villain, Jacobs, he's fine. I think David Oyelowo does a really good job with what he's given to work with, but he's not really that memorable of a villain. He's just the big bad businessman. So yeah, I think he's whatever. So overall, he's kind of a weak villain. But again, the rest of the movie is so good that I really don't care. This is a fantastic movie. This is a great start to what I think is a fantastic trilogy. And I'm going to put it right next to Escape from the Planet of the Apes in A tier. All right, coming up on our final two films in this series, we are going to go to Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. This is when Matt Reeves took over the franchise after Rupert Wyatt directed Rise. And this, to me, is... I think it's a near flawless film. I think Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is an excellent movie. It's an excellent sequel. It's honestly one of my favorite sequels of all time. I have so much love and respect for it. Just starting with Andy Serkis. His performance in this is outstanding. I think he does even better here than he did in Rise. But for me, it's Toby Kebbell. Toby Kebbell as Koba is phenomenal. I think he steals the show completely. He does such a great job, and he gives us such an incredible villain. I think Koba is my favorite villain of the entire Planet of the Apes series. Koba is such a well-rounded, well-developed character, and Toby Kebbell brings him to life with so much intensity, so much anger, but also vulnerability, and it's really, really a sight to see. As far as the human characters go, I think Jason Clarke and Kerry Russell and Gary Oldman all are really, really good in this movie. I actually really like their characters, and I think they do a good job with them. Not as interesting as the ape characters, but I like them, and they do a good job with them. They serve their role in this film, and they serve it well, especially Gary Oldman, who has a couple really, really great scenes. And then, obviously, the CGI. Like I said in Rise, there's a couple shots in that movie that are dated, and it looks great overall. This movie looks 10 times better. This has some of the best looking CGI I've ever seen in a movie, and it's coming up on 10 years old now. It still holds up phenomenally well. It looks incredibly photorealistic, and it really is an achievement what Weta Digital was able to do with this. I love the epic tone and the scope of the whole thing. The way that it's basically a Shakespearean tragedy that's disguised as a summer blockbuster, I love that so much. I think Matt Reeves does a great job at tapping into the depth and the characters and the emotion and the drama of everything going on with this story and with these characters. He does it in a way that it can appeal to the masses. His talents as a filmmaker are on full display with this movie. And then, of course, keep talking about music. Michael Giacchino's score for this is awesome. This is some of the best music since the original film. The themes that he comes up with, that he introduces for this series, are great, and they really add to the overall world and the story and the characters. I think Caesar's arc in this movie is even better than it is in the first movie. Seeing him go from this character who views apes as the superior being, and he sees them all as better than humans, but he has to go through a lot of pain and a lot of turmoil, and the stuff that happens between him and his son before he finally realizes apes are just as fallible as creatures as humans are. I think that's a really great arc for him to go on in this movie, and I really, really appreciate what they did with him as a character. I also think the relationships with all the characters are really well done. I love the dynamic between Caesar and Blue Eyes, and Caesar and Koba, and Malcolm and his family, and Malcolm and Caesar. There's so many great relationships that are explored. And again, talking about Matt Reeves, it's just such a well-directed, well-paced movie from start to finish. From that awesome opening sequence with the map showing the virus spreading and the opening on Caesar's eyes and then closing on Caesar's eyes. It's a remarkable movie. I really, really love this movie. It is one of my favorite sequels of all time. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. And I gotta be honest, the more I'm thinking about it, I think this is going right up with the original Planet of the Apes in S tier. I think Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is a phenomenal film. It's a phenomenal Planet of the Apes film, and it's one of my favorites. And now, finally, we get to the last film in the Planet of the Apes saga, at least until May of next year, War for the Planet of the Apes. I think this movie is really, really fantastic. I don't know if I like it more than Dawn or not, but it's so close. It's so incredibly close, and it's just a really phenomenal way to end this trilogy, and it cements this trilogy as one of the all-time greats. Again, starting off with Andy Serkis. He saves the best for last. I think he is incredible and the best of the trilogy in this movie, and I think it's the best performance of his career. I also think Woody Harrelson is great in this movie as the villain. And I actually think the Colonel is a really, really great villain. A little bit one note, but you can still kind of empathize where he's coming from. You understand he's crazy. He's crazy in the head. He's a bad person, but you understand why he's doing what he's doing, and you can really feel that he believes in what he's doing and that what he's doing is good. He believes in his cause. I also really like Steve Zahn as Bad Ape. I think he's really funny, and he adds that necessary comedic relief to the movie overall, and I think the character is really fun and adds a lot to the film. I also really like Amia Miller as Nova. I think she does a great job, and especially considering I think she's like 9 or 10 years old in this movie. I really liked what she brought to the table here. It's something different, something that I wasn't expecting when I saw it. I really appreciated her, and I appreciated that character. The CGI in this movie, again, just like in Dawn, continues to top itself. It's perfect. There's not a single flaw with any of the visual effects in this movie. It looks real. Everything in this movie looks like it was shot in front of a camera. It's insane. I don't know how they were able to achieve it, and I never will. It's mind-blowing to me what they can do with visual effects when you just take the time and utilize your budget well, and you have performances to base it off of. It really is a stunning achievement. I don't know if they're going to be able to continue that trend with the next movie, but it seems like they are, and I hope they do. This is also an incredibly emotional movie, and that's why it's hard for me to put it under Dawn, because I think this movie is the one thing that it does better than Dawn, I think, or at least for me puts it over in one aspect, is when I watch this movie, I am very emotionally moved throughout the entire thing. I am on the verge of tears throughout almost the entire movie every time I watch this. It's so hard to watch in some scenes. It's a really dark movie. It's a really intense story, and I love that about it. I love that it took this direction in such a dark turn after the first two films, which were already pretty dark and really serious and intense, but this takes things to a whole other level. And something that I love about this movie, and I think this is one of the reasons that some people don't like this movie as much as the other two, this is a movie that is about war. It's not a war movie. And obviously the marketing for this movie was incredibly misleading. I understand why some people thought it was going to be this big battle between humans and apes, and then it really wasn't about that. I get it. I understand the disappointment, but I think what we got instead was something a lot deeper and a lot more interesting. And I really, really enjoyed what Matt Reeves did in telling a story that takes place during a time of war and explores themes about what the impact of war can do and what it can do to people, what it can do to someone like Caesar. We see that throughout this movie, what war does to someone like him and the dark turn it can take on him. Someone who is even as good as Caesar can, become consumed by hate and rage. I love that about this movie. I love that the way it utilizes the war. And like I said, again, I just love the way Caesar is explored as a character in this movie. And another thing I really love about this movie, and I haven't really talked about these two characters throughout the last two films, but Rocket and Maurice. I love both these guys. I think they're both great in Rise. I think they're both awesome in Dawn. But in this movie, we get to see the friendship and that brotherhood between Caesar, Maurice, and Rocket really thrive and at the forefront of this movie. These are the three characters that we love. This is a team that we love, and we finally get to see them in this movie be a team, and it's awesome. I really love that about this movie. It is fully their story, and it's fully Caesar's story, but they're along for the ride with him. They're with him at every step of the way, and I love that so much. Michael Giacchino's music, I already said it with Dawn, I think that's some of the best that the franchise has had to offer. I think War for the Planet of the Apes has the best musical score, not just of the entire Planet of the Apes franchise. I think it does top the original Planet of the Apes in terms of music. This is one of my favorite musical scores that has ever been composed, ever. I think Giacchino's work in this is some of the best of his career. It's outstanding what he was able to do here. He evokes so much emotion, he evokes so much maturity, he evokes so much intensity and sadness, but he also finds those upbeat moments, and he also finds those adventurous moments here and there. It's so haunting and it's so moving, and I love what he does to the table. It's very much, honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of the entire movie. It actually adds to the emotion and it adds to the story and the characters as a whole for me. It makes it an elevated experience for me. As for what I don't like, I wouldn't even say I don't like these scenes. These are just the two things that kind of stick out for me when I watch them. Pacing wise, it's not as tight as Dawn. I think Dawn was such a tightly made movie, pretty much perfectly paced from beginning to end. There's a couple moments through this where it's a little, I wouldn't even say it's slow, I just think it's a little uneven in terms of its pacing. And then there's like a couple of little plot holes that exist there throughout the movie. One example is, this is the one everyone points out, is the scene where Nova goes to deliver food and the doll to Caesar. How would she have gotten in? All that kind of stuff. I get it. It doesn't really bother me that much, but it is something that I do notice when I watch the movie, and I wonder about it myself. But the scene is such a beautifully done moment that I don't really care. And then, towards the end of the movie, Caesar just conveniently survives his wound long enough to get to the desert. There's little things like that just conveniently throughout the movie. Other than that, I have no issues with this movie. I think it is a phenomenal end to this trilogy and a phenomenal entry in the Planet of the Apes saga. It's really tough for me to rank this one. It's even tougher for me to know where I put it in this tier list, but honestly, the more I've talked about it, the more I'm thinking about it, I think I'm gonna put this one in S tier. I think War for the Planet of the Apes is a towering achievement in this franchise. To me, it's one of the smartest, most mature blockbusters that we've gotten probably in the last 15 years. It's so well done, and I love it so much, and that is why it's going to go in S tier. So guys, that was my tier list for the Planet of the Apes series. I had a lot of fun doing that. It was awesome getting to talk about all these movies that I love so much. I talked actually a little bit more than I intended, so this video might actually end up being a little longer than I originally planned on being, but I don't care. I'm going to talk even more about every single one of these movies when I do all these reviews over the next few months, so I hope you're looking forward to that, because I really am. If you have any opinions about my tier list, let me know. Let me know what yours are, or let me know what you're ranking or whatever. Let me know what your thoughts on all these movies are. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say and what tiers you would put all these movies in. I'm looking forward to hearing what all of you guys have to say down in the comments. Thanks so much for checking out today's video here on Ape Nation. If you liked this video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so that you can stay up to date on all things apes. I'll catch you in the next one. So until then, goodbye.